I'm excited to have a conversation with these guys about the future of food with you all. But before we dive in, we have a special treat for you guys because Deniz has a special announcement. His company, Prolific Machines, is coming out of stealth today. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about each of your companies and what you guys are doing and your missions in this world. And we'll go ahead and start with you, Deniz.
Sure. Yeah, we're coming out of stealth today. Prolific Machines is a biomanufacturing platform. We're inventing a new way to grow cells without any recombinant proteins, which are the largest input cost into cell manufacturing. And we're starting with cultured meat as the first application, but ultimately we want to apply this to any area where you need to grow cells. So cell-based therapies or regenerative medicine or antibody production, all those things.
I run a company called Tomorrow Farms that we think about as the front end or commercial layer to the future of food. Our thesis is that the future of food is driven by incredible platforms for alternative proteins, innovative ingredients, and so much more. But at our current point in that transition, many of those companies are not building out commercial infrastructure to actually get into the hands of consumers. And so Tomorrow Farms builds products and brands that are better for people, kinder to animals, and easier on the planet, but focuses specifically on partnering with the most innovative food tech companies around in order to do so. Our first product is a line of animal-free dairy milk made with a precision fermentation technology. The brand is called Bored Cow, and we launched it about 2 months ago.
It's very tasty. I've tried it.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica, and I'm the CEO and one of the 2 co-founders of Sundial Foods. At Sundial, we're developing a novel manufacturing process for creating whole cuts of plant-based meat.
Also very tasty. I've tried Jessica's chicken.
Indeed. Well, thank you, guys. I appreciate it again for joining us on this panel. So there are hundreds, if it feels like thousands, but it's probably hundreds, of new food companies trying to reinvent proteins. It's coming out every day, case in point. What do you guys think is the difference? How can a consumer or an investor understand and tell the difference between all of these different companies that are in the space?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think the cultured meat industry right now is quite similar to the automotive industry in the early 1900s, where there were like hundreds of car companies and pretty much nobody owned a car. And then Ford invented the assembly line, and the cost of manufacturing of cars plummeted, and then cars went from something that pretty much nobody owned to something that everybody owned, and became a mass market item that changed the world. And we think a lot about this at Prolific Machines, how like you need to build an assembly line for biology to bring the cost down, to take these alternative proteins from something that pretty much nobody uses right now to something that everybody uses. So that's how we think about it. So it's focusing on manufacturing.
Got it.
Because if you can't do manufacturing, you're completely reliant on the companies that can do manufacturing, and you're hoping that they're not supply constrained and then they can give you the product. But in cultured meat, for example, I think all of the players will be supply constrained. And so how the hell are you going to get your product if you don't do your manufacturing? You're at the whims of the companies that do.
Got it. So the ability to scale.
Yeah, the ability to be the low-cost provider in manufacturing, like that's the whole point of Prolific Machines.
Got it. Thank you. Ben?
I think, first of all, something that's core to our thesis is we need hundreds and thousands of these companies working on this problem to get into the hands of consumers. And we're leading first with taste. And in that world, when you go to a supermarket, there are a dozen options for hot dogs on the shelf. And you're choosing one not based on what they do and how they made that, but like which one you like more from the barbecue you were at last weekend. And success for all of us is displacing those products completely, and there being no reason why you don't choose this next generation of food that is better for our planet, better for our bodies, so on and so forth. When we think about differentiation in the space right now, especially from an investment standpoint, we think about the extent to which you are sort of vertical or horizontal in the space. And for us, we think a lot about the things that it takes to get into the hands of consumers. We think about the need for new certifications for this future of food, where labels like organic and GMO-free no longer make sense. And that's where sort of our differentiation in the space is. It's how do we think about electronic data interfaces with retailers and growth strategy, website optimizations, brand building, as well as freight, fulfillment, supply chain, so that if you're a brilliant scientist working on a next generation protein to remove cows from our dairy aisle, we are the place to get you to market. And so to answer your question directly, it is, to what extent are you building end-state consumer products, brands, manufacturing capability, et cetera, to get us closer to this vision of the future?
So if I'm to paraphrase, would it be fair to say that you're looking at distribution and the interface with the customer as being the way you're thinking about differentiating?
Yeah, rather than start our flywheel at scientific discovery within a platform, which is a huge opportunity, but necessarily constrains you to whatever platform you're building. We're starting at the point of consumer and retailer interest and understanding what there actually is space for in the market and building a flywheel around going from, oh, consumers are ready for this. What is the most exciting technology that can get that product into consumers' hands so that we can kick off this flywheel to effectively transition our food system to something that is more equitable and harmonious?
Great, thank you. Jessica.
I think I would have a different answer between investors and consumers. For consumers, you're right, there are a lot of companies in this space, whether they're doing plant-based or some other method of alternative protein. I don't think that consumers can differentiate between all of them. I think there are too many, and that maybe some of them will go further than others, and we'll have to see, and a lot of that's going to depend on, of course, consumer reaction. Like you said, taste is a top driver, and so we will just have to find out. Depending on the company, though, I do think there are a lot of differentiating technologies behind the different products that are on the market or that might be coming to the market. And it'll be a matter of which of these technologies is able to produce products cheaper, faster, better, and truly compete with animal meat in the future.
Got it. Thank you. It makes me think, right, like the demand for meat in the next 30 years is projected to almost double. Yet, and we're witnessing this today, the supply chains that make up our food chain are being disrupted all the time. We'll get back to this more later, but how, with the dwindling resources that are needed to raise cattle, raise chickens, I recently wrote an article and didn't know this, but realized 72 billion chickens are killed a year. That's a lot of resources for 72 billion animals, right? And with water, land, and all these things starting to have competition with other products needed, how do we close this gap? And how does the consumer end up closing the gap between, if we just take it on face value, the price of meat to continue to rise? Where do you see this getting resolved?
Yeah. I think this is an absolutely fundamental question that not enough people are talking about. The demand for meat is going to double, but if the supply can't double, then where the hell's all this meat going to come from? And I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think that there's a single magic bullet, but I think it's interesting to think about, because if you look at the numbers on plant-based meat and the other alt meats, currently they're doing between 1 to 3% of total sales in meat, which means that 97% plus of people are not buying meat alternatives right now. They're just buying normal meat. But if normal meat can't produce the supply because we don't have enough water and we don't have enough land and we don't have an atmosphere that can support a doubling in methane, then where does that leave you? I think it basically leaves you with cultured meat. But cultured meat can't work unless you have a way to produce it at a price point which can compete with factory farming, which is extremely difficult. And that's the whole point for prolific machines existing.
Got it.
I'll take the opportunity to talk a little bit about how we see it as a company, which is we believe that there's a massive gap in the market right now for someone to build the trusted monogram for the future of food. And that the days of large CPG conglomerates relying on one 10 to 20 to maybe $100 billion brand that sells potato chips in every school in the country is and should be over. And the question is, what does that future look like, and where can consumers go to know and trust those brands? There is a reason that those large players have been dominant for so long. There's massive economies of scale in this space. The ability to get product into retailers and support CapEx for manufacturing to retail displays are critical issues that we believe someone needs to be focused on solving. And it's why our thesis is so focused on partnering with amazing food tech companies who are building ingredient inputs into that future, while we can focus on building a place that consumers know and trust so that they can effectively make good choices with this transition. I love the way that Deniz thinks about appetite not changing. So the question is, how do you meet them where they are?
I really think that it's a question of manufacturing efficiency. Animal farming may not be sustainable. It might not be able to sustain increased demand for meat, but it's definitely efficient. And it might take a decent amount of time for plant-based to become that efficient and cell-based as well. But we can only hope that all of the innovation that we're doing and that many other companies are doing is helping us get there so that we can support increased need for protein, because animal meat is probably at its maximum efficiency already.
Yeah, we'd have to just find more land and find more water. Go ahead.
Yeah, on that efficiency point, I think it's very interesting thinking about like the fundamental inefficiency of animal meat, right? Because if you think about a cow, it's like a cow. You feed it in calories, but the cow has to make like horns and eyes and a brain and like ovaries, and you like don't want any of this stuff, right? You just want fucking steaks and burgers, but you can't stop the cow from making horns, and so you've got like this fundamental calorific inefficiency with cows and with other animals that they just make stuff that we don't actually want, and so that's the real promise of alt meats in my mind, is that you solve this fundamental calorific inefficiency.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? If you think about it that way, how do you make a cow more efficient biologically? You kind of end up at cell-based meats. I hadn't thought about it that way before. Thank you. We were talking about supply chains for the traditional agricultural supply chain, but supply chains for early stage companies especially, when they break, the company breaks because you don't get a second chance at your runway. How do you guys think about your own supply chains and securing them as you guys scale and grow, where missing an order or getting held up could easily mean you don't get the revenues, and especially in this market, you don't get another chance?
This is a really big problem right now for all biotech companies. At Prolific Machines, the biggest supply chain problem we have is with bioreactors. So there's like a global steel shortage right now. So if you want to buy like a big bioreactor, you're looking at like a 18-month to 2-year timeline, maybe even longer if you want a really big one, which is like a really big problem. It basically means that like you really have to get your shit together in a way that you didn't have to when the supply chain meant that you could just buy a bioreactor in like a month. If you have to wait like 2 to 3 years to get a bioreactor, like at Prolific now we're being forced, which is probably a good thing, to make like 7-8 year plans. Because if you don't think ahead and make like a plan that is that long, you're just gonna fuck yourself later when you try to be like, oh, well, I need a bioreactor. It's like, I can't buy one for 3 years. It's like, oh.
Yeah, it makes it dangerous, right? Like it becomes a dangerous path because the fundamental advantage, the fundamental thing you can do with startups is move around and pivot and be nimble. But if you're now doing long lead time things, you got to figure out how to be more right than wrong and build in buffer, and that requires more financing and that kind of stuff. But yeah, that makes sense. I like the way you're thinking about that.
I think the first thing to note is that the supply chain is breaking down for companies whether or not they're working on the future of food. And so, our first product is the world's first animal-free dairy milk. It is dairy-identical milk. It's not oat milk. It's not almond milk. It is bio-identical to what you would find in dairy. There was just no cow in that process for the first time ever.
Hell yeah.
Which is great. We talked to a retailer this week, a large retailer who does not have traditional dairy milk in any of their stores in the entire state of Florida. Because their supply chain is also a mess. Refrigeration capabilities are breaking down. They're not able to reach all the way to the southern tip of Florida with these stores. The prices are coming up drastically on traditional animal agriculture products. And so the cost gap, the supply chain issues are meeting each other very, very quickly as everyone in our space is figuring out how to do this and gaining that scale. And the traditional, quote unquote, traditionals are sort of like losing it and making it up to our point. I think it's why a lot of the winners in this space will be venture-backed. At some point, you have to make some bets on your capital expenditures and your ability to develop manufacturing capabilities and purchase ingredients for your product that may be a little further out than what you are comfortable doing. Scale is a huge opportunity to drive down your costs to offer this to consumers. And when we as a company think about what makes people transition, price and taste are sort of the only two things that matter.
Yeah, I would agree and say that, honestly, for us, it's been a little bit of having to desperately pitch suppliers because we are a super early stage startup, and as we're slowly moving from kind of this pilot scale to actually having to do industrial full-scale manufacturing. It's a lot of building a close relationship with suppliers and having backups for our backups on different plant ingredients and kind of begging them to set aside a part of their future crop for us. But we know that, it's not just us and it's not just plant-based companies that are facing these issues. So it can be very difficult to do that. And prices are definitely going up. Then also on the manufacturing side, just longer lead times can be very painful when you're trying to quickly iterate. As we're building our manufacturing process, things like lack of access to electronic parts has made us, I would say, a little bit more scrappy, which has been an adventure, not one we necessarily expected.
That's great. And so we talked a little bit about the current financial environment not being so conducive to raising money as easily or having it at least be more dilutive if it is. And so how is that affecting your guys' plans, your strategy? Are you reacting to it, or are you like, heads down, literally doesn't matter, we're going over there? How do you guys think about the current financial environment?
I think it's a good thing. I think there are a lot of bad companies getting funded in these last few years, and hopefully bad companies won't get funded in this environment. And if those bad companies die, then there'll be more market share for the great companies. And yeah, I think the truly great companies that are adding a lot of value will always be fine in any financial environment because you're adding real value. And the companies that can't add real value will really struggle, which is probably a good thing in my
How do you
mind.
think investors will measure value?
I have my own answer. Which is,
Profitability.
Yeah? Go ahead, Ben.
I think it's much closer to that than maybe it was recently.
Yeah.
We raised our seed round in April, and I think the macro environment forces us to be a lot more careful with where those dollars are going, and I think that is a massive benefit to us as a company. In the end, truly.
Yeah.
It
Great.
forces us to be much more deliberate with how we are spending our money and where we are spending it, and to keep a not 12-month goal to get to our A round, but a 20-year goal for what we're trying to solve for in mind, and think about the steps to get there.
I think companies will be valued eventually, especially in the food industry, based on revenue multiples. So honestly, right now, it's probably a good reality check for the industry that there should be some pathway from being a venture-funded company selling technology in a dream to being a traditional food company. If your goal is to create an end consumer product, then margins are not going to be extreme in the future because it is the food industry. And so it's almost forcing companies to think more realistically. I don't think it's a bad thing.
That's interesting. I didn't expect that, right? Like this market downdrafts, and then 3 early stage food founders are like, yeah, this is actually good for us to buckle down and figure out the metrics that truly matter, that make us a viable business over time. That's actually really heartening for me as an investor to hear founders saying this. So
I mean, it's
that's
the
fantastic.
classic Warren Buffett quote, right? Be greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy.
Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, here's a positive operating margins. So I think, continuing on the financial track, we're at a finance conference with a lot of hedge funds and people that think a lot about the public markets. And I'm sure there are many people in this room that are short the food industry, short Beyond Meat, short Oatly, and have done well recently if they had those positions on. If I was short the new food sector, what would you say to me? Is there anything you could say to me to get me to change my mind?
I think it depends on what you're shorting. If you're shorting like plant-based meat stocks, that might make sense. And if you're thinking about cultured meat coming online and that's going to disrupt the sales of plant-based meat, I think there's potentially a defensible thesis there. If you're just shorting alt protein or alt meat generally, I would have some serious concerns about that, because it goes back to this paradox that we talked about earlier, which is like, well, if the demand is going to double and you can't change that because people want to keep eating meat, but the supply can't double, the current supply, then like where the hell is all this meat going to come from? And if you're shorting the only viable path for people getting all of that meat, then I think it's quite likely that you're going to lose a lot of money.
Got it. So just change my mind to change my mind, you'd say you have to look at the secular trends,
Yeah.
and it is inevitable
Yeah.
that this is going to be required. So you have to think long-term as an investor versus short-term.
Unless people stop eating meat, which I just don't see happening because it's so culturally ingrained and people are going to keep doing it because we've been doing it for thousands of years. That's my view.
Got it.
Here's how I would change your mind. There's a lot of this conference based on about Web3, and I can use that as a metaphor. 2.0 of our food system is recent, and it's companies like you mentioned who are building products that are good in terms of what they're trying to achieve. They're lessening animal agriculture, they're offering people better alternatives, but they're just trying to mimic the products that we love. Our reason for founding Tomorrow Farms, for starting this company, was I don't want to live in a world without chocolate milk and hot dogs and ice cream and pepperoni, but I don't want to give them up in any way. The Web3 equivalent in the food space is not making alternatives to the products that we love. It is making exactly the products that we love, but changing the foundational system to get there. And in particular, stripping out the agriculture from it. That's how I would change someone's mind, is to say, we are not trying to get you to change your eating habits actually at all. We just think that there's a fundamentally better way to source those products that you're eating. And that's what this next wave of food is about.
Got it.
I think that's a really important point.
Thank you. Jessica.
I think that if we're just looking at meat alternatives in particular, they're just not there yet, because if you look at meat consumption in the US, only about 1/5 of meat actually consumed is processed meat. Most meat purchased and consumed by Americans is more unprocessed, whether it's a whole cut or just something that's more or less straight from the animal. And if you look at the plant-based meats industry and companies like Beyond, they're almost exclusively capable of producing only those comminutive products like chicken nuggets, burger patties, sausages. And that's not actually what Americans eat. And so plant-based meat or other kinds of alternative meat need to be able to recreate those eating experiences that actually address a larger market before it's going to make a difference.
100%.
Our first product is in dairy, as I said, and I think we often live in unrepresentative samples of the world where almond and oat milk is in every refrigerator. You know, it's 90+% of the dairy market that is still traditional dairy, and people drinking a glass of 2% milk at night. Those are the eating habits that we have to change. And we're not going to do it with making another macadamia nut. We're not going to do it with making another processed burger patty from plants. It's how do you actually make the stuff that people's eating and just strip out the animal, whatever it is that we think is creating harm on our bodies and our planet. And that's what we're focused on building.
I think that's such an important point. I think for a long time I thought this was an education problem, where if we just told people how bad it was,
Right.
that meat was bad and milk was bad, that people would just change. And this has been like a decade-long education process, right, where we're trying to teach people about methane emissions and et cetera, et cetera. And if you just look at, as all of that education has happened, meat consumption has just gone up and to the right. So it's pretty clear to me that it's not an education problem. We just have to give people exactly what they want, but without the negative externalities. And I think that's the only way you can expect people to change. People are not, they're not perfect. You have to meet them where they are.
Totally, it's a very fair point. So I think you guys are really starting to circle around what exactly it takes to break out of vegan and into mainstream, mainstream, where everyone in this room is 99 or 100% alternative proteins. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I think I've heard it over and over again now. It's price and taste.
Yeah.
So we've talked about price. That's scalability. That's getting those supply chains right and all that. We haven't talked about taste. Now I'm going to assume then that's the remaining bit on breaking out and getting every single person in this room eating alternative proteins and every single investor in this room going long the sector. So what is the barrier to taste?
Yeah. Well, there's actually been a lot of taste innovation that's happened in the last few decades. There's companies like Givaudan and Firmenich and IFF that have these small molecule cocktails that can make anything taste like anything.
Right.
So I think taste from a scientific perspective is actually quite a solved problem. At Prolific, just to answer your question, Alec, if you think about it, there's 3 core pillars that have to be true for our company to work. One is that it has to taste the same or better. The second is that it has to cost the same or less. And the third is that it has to have the same nutritional profile or better. And if those three things are true, then we have a real company. And if they're not true, then we don't have anything, in my mind.
Yeah, I've loved the framework ever since Deniz told me that, because it's spot on. As we've been talking about, if you're trying to get to the point where a retailer or a consumer has no choice but to choose your product, then we as companies are reinventing the entire vertical sort of supply chain to get to those people's refrigerators and pantries. And so as a company that thinks specifically about the commercial layer and the platform that someone could come and launch a product off of with alternative proteins to get into someone's home, we are thinking about all of those things. That includes being able to provide scale for manufacturing that gets your costs down. Our dairy product is run on aseptic processing machines, on big Tetra Pak runtimes. That's like really difficult runtime to get that costs a lot of money. And if you are a small player in that world, your tolling costs are going to triple or quadruple compared to large food conglomerates. And so there's all these little pieces like that across our supply chain that we do. I think the other thing is storytelling, which is how you'll start to differentiate when we get to a point where there are 100 different alternative protein companies on your shelf at your supermarket. You know, one of our core theses behind Tomorrow Farms is when you walk into your supermarket in 5 years and you find cell-based sausage on your shelf for the first time, you're trying to figure out what the hell that is. It's the Tomorrow Farms monogram that gives you some trust and comfort in being able to purchase that product. That step function is a tricky one right now because you are dealing with consumers who are unsure about the products that they're eating. And so that storytelling has become a large piece of the work that we think about.
Awesome. Jessica, please.
I definitely agree. I think scale is going to be fundamental to any of this succeeding. But in order for consumers to adopt products, then taste also, not just flavor, but the actual experience should involve as little education as possible and give the consumer the experience they're looking for. So for instance, personal example, we're making chicken wings right now, and they are plant-based. But the idea is, if you were to bite into an animal chicken wing, you'd have a lot of different layers to it. You start with like a crispy, fatty skin, and then you would bite through different layers of muscle fibers. And these fibers are in separate bundles depending on which piece of wing you're eating. And these are going to fall apart in a certain way or peel off the bone in a certain way. And that's the experience that the consumer is expecting. So our goal is to create that expected experience. Then the consumer can check the label and say, oh, nice, this has the same amount of protein and the same macros as chicken. I feel better about myself, and it's animal-free. And so they've had that full experience without the guilt, even though that sounds cheesy. And that makes it just easier for people to adopt.
Got it.
100%.
I see our clock timer has gone to zero and is blinking at us. So unfortunately, I think we're out of time. Thank you all for listening and sharing the panel with us. Thank you.
All right.